Her talk today is about problem-based models for language and culture instruction. Please help me welcome Stacey Johnson.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to all of you for coming this evening. I'm grateful to the LRC for inviting me and to Dr. Kramer specifically. I enjoy talks because I enjoy the interaction. So I'm hoping that this will be the kind of talk where you all feel free to contribute and where perhaps if someone's on Zoom, they might want to put something in the chat. And it's a total free for all, just no rules. I will set the agenda with my slides though. So when I was listening to your introduction, thank you so much for that. I had the thought again that sometimes it's hard to maybe see the thread in my work. So my focus is on adult learning models, how adults learn new things, especially how adults learn big new things, life-changing new things. And for a lot of people, especially in the college age, there's a lot of big transformative moments that are happening. And language learning, there's a lot of evidence that the language classroom is one of the most fertile places for that sort of transformative learning and big learning. And so a lot of my work is about how can we do that more and better and in the types of modalities that we're all working in, which might be online, might be hybrid, or might be face-to-face, sort of like this talk, online, hybrid, and face-to-face. So even though the title of the talk is problem-based models, really the thrust of the talk is how can we live up to our highest ideals as language teachers? How can we do the best by our students and really convey what we're hoping, what our goals are for our instruction? And problem-based learning is just one way we can do that. I'll warn you up front though, I'm not a religious problem-based learning person. I don't think this is going to cure all of our problems, but I do think it presents some interesting ways at looking at the language classroom that might help us get a new perspective and invigorate our teaching. So the first question is, what are the ultimate goals of language study? Like, what's the point of it? Why are we all here? And why do we make our students come to class? Anyone want to chime in? What's the ultimate goal of language study? What's the point of it? Yeah, thank you. 4 things. To master the language, to whatever extent that is actually even possible for students of the age and backgrounds of our students, right? To master it to the extent possible, to understand the culture, to be more open-minded, and to connect with people who are from different language backgrounds. That's a lot. Anything else? Communication. To be able to communicate, which Michael Byram famously in his Teaching and Assessing Intercultural Competence book said the measure of the success of communication is whether or not we can build relationships. So that ties it back to what you said also about connecting with people from different language backgrounds.
Make life interesting.
I love that. My life has actually been so much more interesting because of what languages have brought to it. Okay, so I'm about to present something that will give you an idea. I would say communication for me is tied for the #1 spot, but there's another goal for me that's very close on its heels.
And from Zoom personal growth to have a meaningful purpose.
I love that. The person who wrote personal growth is named Grit. I love everything about that comment. And meaning and purpose are like essential to human life, right? This is who we are. This is how we engage with things. We find meaning, we engage purposefully. So I love all of this. My plan for today is I'm gonna try to rein the context and the big ideas part in, because this is what I get most excited about, but it's not actually the point of this talk. It's just some background. Then we're going to talk a little bit about just learning in general, not necessarily learning languages, but learning. How does learning work? And we're going to make some specific connections to SLA. And then finally, we're going to specifically talk about problem-based models. And this is where I hope we'll get the most audience participation, because I brought some ideas, some things that I'm trying out in my own classroom with me. But my hope is to mine the wisdom of the group so that we can generate more examples from everyone's practice, and also maybe brainstorm what could this problem-based model look like for us. Okay, so context. What does it mean to learn languages and be part of multilingual communities in the time and the place where our students live? And I think this is the specific connection to time and place is really important, because our students are not learning languages in a vacuum. They actually have background experiences with language and with specific languages, and they have experiences in a social language communities. So how does that affect what we do in the classroom? Can I ask you, is this too close to me?
No, it's perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, so here are some tweets. These tweets are from January 20th, 2021. This is just one example of a world event that people tweeted about in ways that are relevant to the time and place where our students are learning languages. I could find hundreds of examples like this online, but I chose a presidential inauguration, which was on January 20th, 2021. Jennifer Lopez, I think she's fantastic. And it was like my dream come true that she was singing at a presidential inauguration. And she went above and beyond my greatest expectations. And she spoke words in Spanish during her club bop during a presidential inauguration. It was fantastic. Not everyone had the same excitement about that song or about her speaking Spanish at the inauguration than I did. So here are just a few tweets that exemplify some of the things people were saying. This is America, we speak English. Just to be clear also, the words that she was saying were the Pledge of Allegiance, specifically the part where it says, "One nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." She said those words in Spanish in the middle of her song. This is America, we speak English. Another person said, "No idea what J-Lo just belted out in Spanish. Try communication with everyone." I actually I love how these are escalating. These are presented in a particular order. First of all, there's a one-to-one relationship between the country we live in, which apparently is called America, and the language of English, not American. Like if it was England and English, that's still not true. England is a multilingual place, but I could like cognitively process it more. But the one-to-one relationship between America and English, cognitively, that's a hard leap for me to make, but this is clear for this person, right? Then we're gonna one up that and say, not only is there a one-to-one relationship, but if you communicate in languages that aren't English, you are intending to exclude. You are not communicating with everyone. You are communicating with everyone in America if you speak English, and you are being exclusive if you speak other languages. So these short little tweets are really revealing of the language ideologies, the social context where multilingualism, and in my case, I'm a Spanish teacher, but all examples of multilingualism, you can find similar kinds of responses. And then this one is the most complex of all of them. Speaking Spanish at the American president inauguration. Not everyone speaks Spanish. It was sad and shows a low education. So oops, you told me to watch out for the thing. I kicked it anyway. Okay, so speaking Spanish, once again, we have the one-to-one correlation. We have the idea that when you speak Spanish, you're not trying to communicate with everyone. It's escalating, but now we have this idea that multilingualism, which by the way, Jennifer Lopez worked really hard for. She learned Spanish as a heritage language and spent years learning Spanish. I personally learned Spanish as a second language. I've spent most of my adult life trying to get as good at Spanish as I can. Apparently, all of that effort, all of those classes, all of that formal education shows that Jennifer Lopez has a low level of education. This is, once again, a level of cognitive dissonance that's really hard to make sense of, but this is common. This is a common language ideology that we see all over the place. Did you have something you wanted to add? So, you know, there's lots of different registers of English, and Twitter English isn't always the English people speak with their professors. I'm comfortable with that. But once again, the cognitive dissonance of criticizing someone else who's multilingual as having a low level of education when you're using a variety of English that maybe has its own baggage. There's just a lot going on in these tweets. And we're joking around about this because honestly, you have to laugh to keep from crying sometimes. However, this is not isolated. This is not just J-Lo. This is not just Spanish. Here's just a few screenshots from things online. I don't know if you guys remember this. It was a YouTube video of a lawyer who was screaming in a cafeteria at Spanish-speaking workers who were speaking Spanish amongst themselves, not to him, amongst themselves. It turned out he worked for a law firm that advertised that it was multilingual in Spanish and other languages, but he had a personal visceral reaction against people being multilingual in public. He could see the financial benefit of multilingualism. He was a college-educated lawyer. He probably took the required 2 semesters of Spanish at his fancy college, right? And what did that get him? Speak English, you're in America. This happens all the time. I could just make an entire presentation of headlines of people being told speak English. Here's Latinas talking about their fear of speaking Spanish in public. It's not just in the YouTube age either. Thousands of Native American children historically over more than 100 years in this country had their language systematically removed from them. Cultural genocide. And a few years ago, the whitehouse.gov website removed all of its multilingual pages because the administration thought that all government websites should be in English. And that's the sort of thing that a particular administrator has control over. This is not just something that's happening in Twitter. It's something that we can laugh about, but it's a historical, ongoing problem. And sometimes it's a problem at such a high level. College educated people, people who rise to the highest level in the land, this is a widespread problem. And just in case you were starting to feel hope that, well, our students are experiencing that as input. They live in that social context, but that's not who they are. My own research actually indicates that is who our students are. So research that I conducted years ago, one of the students in this particular class, it was a class of about 25 first-year Spanish students. One of the students said, I thought that someone who is teaching English in an American school should have English as their first language. He was taking a Spanish class from her, but he thought English should be her first language. I know that sounds ignorant, but with the accent, it's like I have to do a little more work to understand what she says sometimes when I shouldn't have to. Other than Spanish, which I have to figure out, I also have to play with her English. And I'm sure as, college faculty and grad students, we all are also aware of the research on international faculty and TAs and how perceptions of language ideologies affect course evaluations and relationships with students. This happens in colleges. The same person, his alias in the study was 10. 10 also said, I used to get really mad when I'd be driving and I'd see a billboard in Spanish. Now I want to tell you that 10 and I had multiple interviews over the course of a semester. So some of these, like the previous quote, he's talking in real time about what he experienced. And now he's looking back on some previous beliefs that he had that he's learning to question. So I used to get really mad when I'd be driving and I'd see a billboard in Spanish. I worked at the zoo for a while, and when the kids came in, I'd be talking to the kids because the parents don't expletive deleted speak English. I used to get really annoyed when I'd see a commercial in Spanish. You know, last time I checked, this was the United States of America. And of course, it's easy to make comparisons between what we just saw in the tweets and what this student talked about in his interviews with me about his experience in Spanish class. The assumptions about language, about multilingualism, about people who are from other places, these assumptions are like the air that we breathe. And so students are coming into our classroom out of that air. They've breathed it in. It's become part of them. And sometimes our students have had certain experiences where they've become aware that they've been breathing this in. And they're working to dismantle some of those ideas. But many times students get to college unaware of how their social context has affected them. So the reason why I said earlier that I have two equally weighted goals. I am very passionate about proficiency, about communicative goals, about making sure that my students, who I will probably only see taking the required courses, my students generally don't go on to be majors. They just take my Spanish 1 and 2 and then move on. I want to make sure that when they leave my class, they can communicate well enough to build relationships with people, that they have the actual language skills and not just the textbook knowledge, right? But two, I want them to understand what it is to breathe in this social context, what it means for that to be a part of you, and how you begin to interact with world events and with new ideas in a different way. I want my classroom to be a place where people transform. So just to take a minute to reflect on this, I'm not going to ask you to talk about the hideous things that have come up in your language teaching context. We all teach in similar contexts, and so I think we have a sense of what some of those stories are. And if you are someone, if you're a teacher who has been the target of microaggressions, or if you have felt like you were having a really negative experience with a certain set of students, I want you to know that I hear stories about that often, and that it's a great idea to form a community and talk about these things and talk about how our classroom practices and our policies enable or help to dismantle that. And so I hope that you do find community with each other if that's something that you're experiencing. However, I can tell you that in the study that I conducted where 10 talked to me about his beliefs, his teacher never had, well, his professor never had any idea that these were his ideologies. He went through class, he got all the work done, he was a solid C student. And then he never saw Spanish class again after he was done with his required course. So you don't always know what your students are carrying around. And especially if you don't have a researcher embedded in your class interviewing everyone, it can be really hard to figure those things out. So what is your language teaching context? Sometimes that can be hard to figure out, but forming community with each other, we can get a better idea. Now, this is where maybe we can be more helpful to each other immediately, is how does our classroom equip students to participate in local and global communities? I don't want to send a student like 10 out into his local community to participate when he gets angry when he sees billboards in Spanish or feels the need to yell at people like the lawyer yelling at multilingual people on YouTube. I don't need him to participate in local communities yet, but I do need my class to help equip him for some ideal future situation where he's reached a point of personal development where that's fruitful for him and for our local multilingual community. So what is my class doing to get him there? That's actually really hard to answer. And so it's where we're going to dig into the research a little bit to be like, what have we seen to be effective? And how does your language program help students make sense of world and local events? So whether your students are coming in with these ideologies or not, they are living in a world that is constantly bombarding multilingualism with this negativity, or where they're seeing stereotypes and generalizations about people. So how does our language program prepare students to effectively engage with those world events, right? Not to be the tweeters we saw earlier, but to engage in more productive, helpful, lifelong ways, right? People are going to speak Spanish at inaugurations all the time. How are we preparing our students to engage with the controversy? Okay. Anyone want to make any comments or push back on any of this so far? So Emma wants to know about the research context where I met 10. It was at a community college in the southern United States. I can tell you though that I've also conducted similar research at a liberal arts college in the Midwest, and I found very similar things. So I don't think geographically we're going to get a lot of difference there. I do think maybe the community college versus liberal arts college might be salient, but my own research isn't complex enough to figure that out. That is a great question. And I love this because what was JLo trying to achieve? And this is the kind of conversation that you're going to have in your classroom if you bring this context up. If we engage with this, everyone isn't going to say, oh, the horror, how could people dislike that? Some people are going to say, yeah, actually, that makes a lot of sense. Why did she do that? So what was JLo trying to achieve? I mean, that is really interesting because as I showed in some of my slides earlier, the concept of linguistic supremacy or white supremacy isn't actually new to any recent administration. English only movements have existed for at least 100 years. They've never been successful in making English the official language of the US. Linguistic genocide has also been standard in the US. I'm thinking about like Japanese internment camps where people weren't allowed to speak Japanese while imprisoned. Native American camps where children were taken from or residential schools where children were taken from their parents and not allowed to engage with their home language and culture while there. So, I mean, this is part of our historical context. And there is something really hopeful about a new administration where she was trying to set a tone of multilingualism. This is a new president, this is a new day, multilingualism, and she is specifically of Puerto Rican descent. Puerto Rico had some real serious challenges during the previous administration. So that could have been what she's trying to do. She actually hasn't spoken on it, but it's interesting to get students to think about what is the point of being boldly multilingual in public in places where it hasn't traditionally happened. And we'll talk a little bit more in just a few minutes if we get that far, because it's going really well so far. Keep it coming. About how we might be able to present things that will cause our students to think critically at their actual language learning level without sacrificing either communication or diverse opinions. Because I'll tell you what, 10 did not change his mind. He did change his mind significantly. I'll give you a little preview to the happy ending. One semester of Spanish with the particular teacher and the particular types of pedagogies that she employed was absolutely transformative. And one of the stories he told me is that he worked as a stalker in the produce section of a grocery store, and he would get mad and sometimes even be verbally abusive towards multilingual people when they would come into the grocery store and speak whatever language amongst each other. By the end of his first semester class, he was excitedly reporting to me, some Spanish speaking people came in the other day and I got to go up them and help them find the chard. How cool is that? And just looking forward to hearing language in public, and maybe it would be one of the languages he knew and he could engage a little bit. So it really was a transformative experience for him. And it wasn't because his teacher said, bad ideology, get rid of that one. It was because she asked him to critically engage with difference. Examine difference, critically assess difference, and reflect on difference. And it turns out that those sort of deep connections that you make with people who are different from you are what humans are built to do. We are built to connect deeply with each other. And when we're learning a new language, we're going to learn a new language more effectively if we have emotional attachments to the people we want to communicate with, right? I don't know, we're just made for connection. And so it turns out that making strong connections to a target language community and to other people in the room who had different opinions turns out to be really transformative in and of itself, even without wagging your finger at folks. So I love that you felt comfortable pushing back, and thank you for giving us like a really measured discussion about how we might talk about difference in the classroom. Okay, so talking about learning, what exactly do we know about how people learn? And I'm not just talking about language learning here, I'm talking about how we learn everything. So there's a concept called problem posing that really informs problem-based learning the way my co-author and I, Claire Knowles, conceptualize it. This is based on the work of Paulo Freire, who's a Brazilian adult literacy educator in the 60s and 70s. And he had the idea of education as the practice of freedom. Education is conscientization, where you become conscious of the ways that you are engaged in oppression, either as oppressed or oppressor. And one of the things that he railed against was what he termed the banking model of education. This is where we imagine our role as the teacher as opening up students' head and pouring in the knowledge. And unfortunately, some of my favorite colleagues who do the best work on communication in their classrooms unintentionally veer into this area sometimes. I am going to speak so much comprehensible language and engage you in so much comprehensible language that this language will start to become your language. And I am just going to deposit all of my comprehensible language right in your head. Now, what we know about SLA is that what I teach, what I give is not necessarily what students acquire. Students have their own internal processes, their internal syllabus, if you will, if Ellis will, that govern how they acquire a language, and input and interaction is absolutely essential. Comprehensibility is absolutely essential, but we can't imagine ourselves as filling up our students' head with language. In order to make meaning, which is essential for language learning, students have to connect it to their own identities, their own experiences, everything that they already know. The idea of conscientization is when students start to see language as part of relationships of power, hierarchies. One of the ways I do this in my Spanish classroom is by intentionally sharing audio, video, and texts that are not the dominant, standardized academic form of the language. Real people speaking the way they speak at home with their mom or on the corner with their friends, and we make sense of it together. This is what real language sounds like. And the Real Academia Española might not approve of this particular language variety, but this is how people talk, right? Conscientization is when you make it clear to your students that language isn't neutral. And I say when I make it clear to my students, it's the students being clear on that is the conscientization. I can't make anyone conscientized or whatever. So, and also connecting students' knowledge and experiences with the content. So I'm not just presenting a series of facts or a cultural knowledge that's easily testable. I'm asking students to process it, make sense of it, and then, interpret it in a variety of ways. And in a language classroom where traditionally culture instruction has been easily testable factoids, I think this is where we see a lot of connections to intercultural communicative competence research and the idea it's not enough just to teach students culture. Students have to engage in a process of reflection and making sense of things and trying things out and experiencing difference. I actually added this slide after our conversation, Emma, so there you go. Transformative learning. So my particular research has focused on transformative learning as a phenomenon a lot, so I added this in at the last minute. One of the keys to transformative learning is that students are coming from a place of generalizations and reductions. That's what we do when we don't have a lot of data. when our brains, not us as people, but when a human brain doesn't have enough data, it tries to create some sort of a generalization so it can make sense of things on a large scale. Well, I don't know what everyone does, but the 4 people I've met do this, so that must be what everyone does. Or I don't know what's normal to eat for breakfast, but my mom always fed us XYZ, so that must be what's normal, right? Generalizations and reductions are how our brains create categories and make sense of things, even when we don't know all the specifics. And this is a real impediment to transformative learning. I would go so far as to say transformative learning is the process of breaking down those hard shells of generalizations and reductives. And the way we do it is often by seeing people as individuals, not as representatives of a whole culture. We're not going to talk about everything they do in Spain or everything they do in Puerto Rico. We're going to, and I always use my own language because I don't want to misstep by using any of your languages as examples. We're going to talk about a specific person. We're going to let them speak in their own words. We're going to learn about them and their experiences. And when students try to zoom out to see things from a generalized perspective, I'm going to ask them to zoom back in and make a close connection. Another really important part of transformative learning is understanding and processing deeply. I like to say this is actually like the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research. Quantitative research, we take more shallow data over a really large sample to draw generalizations. Qualitative research, we dig really deep with a very small sample to understand a phenomenon or a group really thoroughly. And transformative learning is moving towards the qualitative side, deep, thorough processing of a smaller set. Connecting with other people who are on the same journey. So not just connecting with individuals in the target language community, but connecting with people who are in the room and seeing that we're all experiencing the same thing. We're all grappling with the same problems. We're all in this together, and we're coming to different conclusions and we're coming from different places, but this is hard and we're working through it together. And then critically reflecting on experience, which is hard to do in a language classroom, especially the levels that I teach. It's hard to critically reflect in the target language. And so this is a place where I will often ask students to use the L1 outside of class because I personally prefer to use only the target language in class. But outside of class, give them set moments to really think through the big questions and write or create videos about what their learning has been like. And then finally, problem and inquiry-based learning is actually really well researched. It's kind of like a methodology or a strategy, really. It's not a learning, like problem posing is a model for learning. Transformative learning is a model for learning. But this is a teaching model. It's a way we organize the classroom experience. And it has a lot in common with problem posing. It is informed by transformative learning. But the idea is that we start with a complex problem. This is probably where I have to spend the most cognitive energy trying to figure out how to have a problem-based classroom, because a first semester Spanish class coming up with a complex problem that's cognitively engaging for my students, tied to current events and the social context of language, but also that we can talk about with the 47 words we've learned so far, that can be really challenging. So I spend a lot of time here. Once we know what the question is or what the problem is, we have to learn to understand the problem. And that's where we gather resources. Language learning resources can come from wherever you want them to. There's no ideology or set path for this. But the idea is I'm not presenting a resource to students because I want them to get good at recognizing irregular present tense verbs. I'm giving them a language learning resource because I want them to see a particular perspective on this question or this problem, see a first person perspective from someone who's living it. What does this mean for them? What is this person going through? How have they experienced it? So start with a complex problem. Let me also say, this is very scaffolded at the lower levels. I'm coming up with the problem. It can be much less scaffolded at the higher levels. Students can decide, what is a social problem I want to think about, learn about? What is an interesting question that would drive me to gather resources to acquire more language? So as proficiency increases, the scaffolding can decrease significantly, but you can do this at any level. And then gathering resources, once again, very scaffolded. At the lower levels, I'm providing them with the resources they need to answer this question, and maybe giving them limited opportunities to find their own internet stuff that relates to what we're talking about. But as students go higher, they can do real inquiry and real research to find out how are people embedded in this language community, solving their own problems, advocating for themselves, thinking about their own liberation, working towards community goals. How is that already happening? They can do that research in the target language at the higher levels, and then they can report out to their classmates about what they've learned. That leads to step 3, which is collaborating and sharing understanding. One of the keys of problem-based learning is that these problems cannot be solved by a single person. They can't even be solved by our Spanish class. These problems can't yet be solved by the community where the problems are happening, right? These are big, complex problems. So we're not, maybe in a biology class, problem-based learning is this plant is dying. Let's research why the plant is dying, put together an intervention, and then make it live. And there's a particular solution that we can find, and we can find success in solving the problem. But in social and humanities, social sciences and humanities, problem-based learning doesn't have clear solutions like that. It's about understanding the problem, talking about how people are trying to work through the problem. And no one person in the classroom is going to have enough resources to effectively do this work. So this is another thing that can be challenging in the language classroom, creating effective collaborations with students who have limited language proficiency. We don't want to put our students in a situation where they're just stumbling through trying to say things that they really don't have any business saying yet because it's not on their level. So how do we at the lower levels provide a lot of structure and make sure that students are using all the resources they've gathered and have very clear sentence frames and scripts and forms to help them create clear things that they can contribute to the group. And then at the higher levels, how do we give students more freedom to take all the language they've been learning for years, sum up what they've learned about the problem and how people are trying to solve it, and then learn from each other and work together to answer their question. And then finally, reporting out and reflecting on learning. And so there's always a question we're asking in problem-based learning. And at the end, we address the question. The final exam of problem-based learning is whatever question we ask to start, we answer it at the end. The great news about this is that you can do problem-based learning to build your whole course, which I get really excited about, and I'm working through what would that look like. I don't have the freedom to build my own course. We have really coordinated courses where I teach, but I'm imagining if I were to do this at the course level, what would that look like? What I do have the freedom to do, oh, you could also do it at the unit level, right? It would take a couple weeks to work through a problem. But what I do have the freedom to do is do this at the lesson and activity level. So my students come into class, they get a question. We have a textbook resource that will help address that question, and maybe a resource from a real world context. I'm giving air quotes if you can't see that. Real world context that might address the question in a different way. I try to provide 2 or 3 diverse perspectives. And then by the end of the class, they're able to answer the question that we started with at the beginning. So it's a way of framing classroom interactions that we were probably going to have anyway, because my syllabus says you have to teach them indirect object pronouns on Tuesday. And so I have to do that. So we were gonna do those kinds of activities or look at those kinds of resources, but now I can frame it in a way that is communicative, but also helps to connect with what's happening in the world. Okay, take a minute to reflect. What do you want to say? Oh, yes, sorry.
Slide, please.
Uh-huh.
So I think that maybe can it be incorporated with project-based learning as well? So, for example, like in my advanced level Korean, that I asked one of the projects that students need to do is to find out like a complex problem in Korean society. and then related to their major. So so they need to find the resources, and then like through the lens of their from the context that they learned from their major courses, then they need to see the problem in Korea, and then they need to evaluate, and then what's the cause of it, and what will be the solution of it, that kind of thing, and then they need to present and then have a whole class discussion about that. So I think that maybe they are like aligned well with this, problem-based
Yes.
learning. So I think, yeah, I was very
In fact, I have good news for you. You might be doing problem-based learning.
Oh, I
So
didn't
project-based
even
learning and
notice.
problem-based learning come from the same educational school of thought around experiential learning. So we start with concrete experiences, and then the learning flows out of that. Here are the main differences, though. And I'm going to go back to our problem posing slide. So if the question that we're asking, or the problem that students are identifying, you're using project-based learning. If the problem they're identifying is one that connects to social consciousness, hierarchies of power, language ideologies, any of those types of constructions about basically power, then we're engaging in problem posing. But if it's more technical problems like infrastructure, unless we're talking about critical infrastructure, where we're talking about how funding is allocated based on social status or something like that, right? So there are problems that are just interesting projects. And then there's problem posing, which is where we're thinking from a more systems perspective or hierarchical perspective. Another possible difference between the type of problem-based learning we're talking about here and project-based learning writ large is that if students are relying on their content knowledge from their major, which they've gotten from, this American university in a particular place and time, that's fantastic. That's connecting it to their own experiences. The type of problem-based language learning that's going to give students the opportunity to connect deeply in a way that is going to be transformative for them. They have to understand and process deeply the perspectives from within the language community, and they have to connect with the target language community. So if we start by asking them to investigate how are people solving this problem within the community where the problem is, and then ask them, okay, how does your content knowledge compare and contrast to what you've read, then that would definitely be problem-based language learning. But as you can see, the structural components is what you're already doing.
And actually, there is one question on Zoom. Mona,
Great.
do you want to unmute yourself, or do you want to type your question in chat real quick?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello, nice to meet you. My name is Mona. I work at Syracuse University. And
Hi,
my
Mona.
question about problem-based learning is I'm so hesitant to do it because the moment I define the problem, I always feel like I'm taking the chance from the students to define the problem, which would be a big learning step in the first place. Does that make sense to you? And do you have any advice how I deal with that?
Yeah, what level are you considering doing problem-based learning with?
Ideally on any level. So from beginners to 300 lit.
Okay, so I would say that with 300 level class, I also would be concerned about that. However, the idea that we are language teachers and that our students have to have communicative outcomes, our classes have to result in communication in another language, that has to coexist, right? We can't abandon our communication goals in order to further these critical thinking goals. And in fact, the further students go along in our program, the more they'll be able to advance on both levels. The lower level classes are going to have lower proficiency goals and lower critical thinking goals because they're just getting started in the process. So I love that question. And I think by the time they're at the 300 level, that sounds like a time when you could ask students to maybe not identify their own problem individually, but maybe everyone identifies a problem and then they work together in groups to pick one that the group finds most interesting and refine it. And then maybe the instructor can help them decide what resources would be most useful to address that question. But at the first semester level, it's okay with me that my students aren't able to do all the things they'd be able to do if they were doing the same methodology in a history class. Because we are learning to use the language to engage the world, but actually using the language has to coexist equally. So it's okay to do less. It's okay to just do a little, actually. It's okay to just take a few steps in the right direction without going all in on this. Like I said, it's not a religious experience. You can try it out. You can test it to see if some of this stuff helps. If it helps you get closer to your goals of opening your students' mind and connecting them with other people. And if you find it doesn't, I'll come back and I'll do a different presentation on a different structure and we'll try that one next.
Did we have a question in the audience? Did you have a, hang on, hang tight. Tight, literally.
I was just wondering, because we're teaching German, first level German here this semester, and I have a class in which I feel people are so curious about the ins and outs of grammar, and you know,
Oh my
they
goodness,
want-
really?
And then when I have those kind of activities, they're like, yeah, on with it. But why is the, why is the adverb like this in this position and not? And they, most of them seem fascinated by it. And I was wondering, how do you deal when you meet a class that has a different characteristic, that would like respond better to other things?
I mean, that's an amazing question. I can only tell you that I have a overbearing personality and it's hard to wriggle out from underneath my lesson plan. I dare them to try. I mean, I think it's okay to go with the flow with student interests. I'm fine with that. One of the things that I do in my class actually is I have an agenda for the class that I print out on paper, and it has spaces for all the things that we're going to do for them to actually write with their hands on a piece of paper in class. And instead of writing in their textbook or in their own folder or whatever. And so one, that forces me to be really intentional when I'm creating the agenda for class to make sure it's feasible and we can do all the things I'm putting on the paper, because I look bad if we don't get to it. But it also gives me the opportunity to say, that's a great question. Office hours for that, because we still have 3 things left on the agenda for today. Which I love answering student pop-up grammar questions is what some people call that. Like we'll co-construct something they want to say. I'll write it on the board and then someone will be like, well, what's that letter A doing right there? I'm like, have we never seen this before? This is a fun thing. You're going to see this all the time. So I enjoy doing stuff like that. But with everything that I pick out, it's because I have intentionally selected it to be the maximally beneficial for my learning outcomes. And so I don't want to let students hijack what I think are the main points of language classrooms, which is communication and transformative learning. I don't know that that's a satisfying answer. Other people have ways that they manage that?
Probably would have approached it differently. I would have.
Great.
So you're coming from language X. So how would you express it in that language? And is there a difference? And what would you gain from that? And then you can turn it around into a critical reflection on how different languages are structured. And then you're at the same, you're back to your original goal, basically.
I love that. And that actually feeds back into the transformative learning piece also, because engaging with difference, whether it's linguistic difference or cultural difference or difference of opinion and perspective, when we can connect in spite of differences, Those are the moments that cause us to rethink, well, maybe the way my mama taught me to do it isn't the only way. Maybe the way I've done it my whole life is not always right, or not the only right way. And that's what leads us into the good critical reflection. So thank you for sharing. That's a great solution.
We have one more on Zoom. Do we want to?
Yeah, so Stacey, being mindful of the time here, can you wrap up in 5 minutes and then we'll take Daryl's
I
question?
thought this was a 3-hour talk. I still have like 40 more slides.
I'm sure we're all happy to stay longer, but do you want to?
Oh, sorry. Okay. The entire third part we haven't gotten to, I just told you, this is how I control my agenda in class, because this is what happens if you let things go off the rails. Okay, so really quickly, in my own first and second semester classrooms, here's an example of some of the questions that I use to frame a lesson. So I'm still using the textbook resources that I'm required to use. I'm adding in a resource that I created, or an authentic resource from the internet, or some cool infographic or something along the way to give students a concept of individual experiences. But some of the questions that we ask are, how is identity both visible and invisible? And this allows us to have some really interesting conversations. These words happen to be cognates in Spanish. So like week 2, we can say, my name is Stacey. I'm from such and such a place. I like such and such a thing. And here's the way my identity is visible and invisible. We can do this right away. Is school for everyone? There's always a school chapter in the first semester. I can find authentic resources of people who say they hate school and wish they didn't have to go. People who say they wish they could go to school, but women aren't allowed to in their country. People who say, right, we can find all sorts of resources to support individual experiences that give diverse perspectives on this question that are comprehensible if you know the vocabulary from the school chapter. Where does my food come from? This is actually one that I stole from an amazing teacher in North Carolina who has a farm workers unit. She decided, why are we talking about going out for tapas and drinking wine when we could be talking about labor movements and local food and how much you get paid to pick strawberries in North Carolina? And what's the meaning of a name? Do names always have a meaning? Do we change names depending on what language we speak? What does it mean if someone changes your name for you without your consent? Because in my textbook, there happens to be a little reading about a kid named Jesus who, when he moved to Texas, people started calling him Jesse. He did not consent to that, and it had a really big impact on his life. And so we can talk about, what does it mean to be a Jesus who's now a Jesse? Okay. We can also make strategic decisions about resources. So level appropriate, thoroughly processed, not just looking at a resource one and done, trying to get the bare minimum out of it, but really giving students a chance to explore it and think through it and compare it and make connections to it. And centering real people with the resources we choose, not generalizations. Oh my gosh, I have so much left. And then building community and trust. And that goes for the language community we're learning about, and also for the community in class. And I think that's all I can, I'm 5 minutes late.
No worries. So Daryl, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hello, what a great talk. I really felt over and over. That's
Thanks.
been my experience. That's been my experience. Or I would like to be that kind of professor. So I have a selfish question that touches on ethics and being a responsible, I started to say fellow citizen, but I think fellow human might be more appropriate. I teach Spanish here at Cornell. I've also taught at a lot of public and private colleges that are very different from Cornell. And I have met students who sound similar to your informants, and that they have a lot of anxiety and even anger when they encounter Spanish. So I'm a white American man who learned Spanish in college. And I noticed that white American men frequently feel like they can talk to me. And sometimes they share xenophobic and racist sort of perceptions of Spanish. So my question is, do you have any suggestions based in your research and personal experience as an interviewer that might help me with my positionality? Also, as a person who's also devoted his life to teaching Spanish and to Spanish from Latin America, when I encounter that resistance, and I'm especially interested in your strategies with informants that might balance humor and approachability, without seeming to ratify their own racist or xenophobic positions, because it seems to me that problem-based strategies might sometimes go the wrong way. And I wonder if that's been your experience, that might go in an anti-social way instead of pro-social. And again, thank you so much for your talk. I've learned a tremendous amount.
Yeah, I can't remember any of the questions you just asked except for the last one. Did someone write them down?
I was trying to be brief.
I'm sorry,
Have you
Daryl, you're
had
gonna
it-
have to, we're gonna
Yeah,
have to
I was trying to be
extend this.
brief by writing my question down. So I'll give it to you again.
Strategies for when people think it's safe to be racist to you. Is that one of the things you asked?
That's part of it. So, you know, you present them with the problem and they talk to you, maybe during office hours, maybe in a group discussion, not usually in front of the entire class, at least here at Cornell. What are the best practices based in your research or your personal experience, as very obviously a dynamic, you know, person who people want to talk to? How do you balance that without being sort of, you know, you should believe the way I believe, and
Well,
instead try to
Daryl,
use humor? Yeah,
I have to answer it now before I forget. I'm sorry.
good, fine.
I think it's okay to say you should believe as I believe. If I don't think it's okay to enforce that, like, but if that's what's going on in my head, I think it's okay to say that out loud. Like, I don't feel at all comfortable with what you just told me. And in fact, it's in direct contrast to some of my most deeply held beliefs. This is a real point of conflict for us. I wish you believed what I believe, and then we wouldn't have this conflict. I think those things are fine. Where it gets tricky is not that we're having a difference of opinion, it's the value judgment about who you are, how you treat people, whether you're a good person. That's what ruins the relationship. So how can I be honest about what I'm thinking and what my positions are, but still express to you that I think you're a person with a tremendous amount of humanity and potential and beauty, and I don't know how it's possible we have a difference of opinion on this. Like, it baffles me. But I still want to get to know you, and you're an important part of this class. And if we can work from that place, I think I can honestly disagree with my students without getting the dreaded, she was talking about her political beliefs the whole time in class, right? Because I do talk about my own beliefs sometimes, and I want students to talk about their own beliefs sometimes. But where I redirect the conversation in class is that this class is not about me getting in touch with my feelings or you getting in touch with your feelings. That's not the point of this class. Learning about the target language and the communities that speak it is the point of this class. So we're not going to center your beliefs or mine. We're going to center theirs. Now, the good news is I get to pick out at the lower levels which resources we examine. So I get to center the ones I like. And often students will bring things that are counterexamples. Say, oh, I read this and it's different from what you showed us. I'll be like, yes, that opinion also exists. I didn't bring it because I didn't like it. I wanted us to look at these. But starting out with that radical honesty and genuine care for each other, I think can be really helpful. I also want to tell you, Daryl, that I am from Tennessee. I'm not from Tennessee, but I grew up in Tennessee and I work in Tennessee. And there have been many times in my life where people found out I'm Southern and thought it was okay to be racist to me. And I'm like,
from
wow,
Arkansas.
in the South?
I'm from Arkansas, just to give the
Oh,
context.
Daryl,
So,
I went
yes.
to Arkansas
I think
Tech
you
for a
understand.
year.
I'm feeling a lot of
Yeah.
similarity here. Yeah.
Yeah, so in the South, people can just smell that it's not safe to be racist to me. But other places, Southern equals safe to be racist. And so this is something I am always thinking about. Like, how am I conveying safety, which I love? I want everyone to feel safe around me. And how can I be honest when you cross the line without violating any potential relationship we might have? So that's my starting place.
That was so useful. Thank you. I'm going to be reaching out to you. I really appreciate your
I
talk and that
can't
answer.
wait.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to talk about where you're from in Arkansas. I love that state. Not now though, because we're late.
Are you willing to entertain a few more questions?
I want people to know that if you're in the room, feel free to eat and drink. You don't have to wait until the talk is over. And if you're on Zoom, I'm just so grateful that you hung out this long. I do not want to miss any questions.
because we do have a question from Sujata on Zoom. Sujata, do you want to? There.
Hi.
Hi, Sujata.
Hi. Thank you so much. I really was really enjoying this whole talk very much because for my higher level classes, for my second and third year classes, social justice issue is something which is I'm really deeply thinking to really incorporate more and more in my courses. But and I think it kind of what you were talking and asking, telling Daryl about, kind of answered my question, but I will just give you a scenario and maybe you can help me with this situation probably. So one thing that comes up in my higher level classes is that when I ask students, I think the challenging part is like to not really know exactly where to start a certain topic of social justice. For example, you mentioned to me that, okay, this multilingual topic for you, I wanted to understand because that was very important for you and that is how you brought it up first, or was it something that you felt like in general students are also experiencing and it's something that was brought up by students and you thought it is a common topic to start with? The reason I'm asking is that because I ask sometimes students like, okay, you tell me what are some of the social issues that you would like to talk about, and then we can design our course based on that. And a lot of times I feel like students are not really prepared to come up with a certain answer right away. And at that point of time, one worry that I have is that the topics that I'm going to bring up, are they going to be reflecting my own choices and my own perspectives? And again, is it going to impose, is it going to seem that I'm imposing my ideologies there? You see what I'm trying to say?
Absolutely. Let me see if I can remember. I have a terrible memory. Okay, first of all, before I was a language instructor, part of my career was working with immigrants and refugees in a nonprofit context and working with multilingual children in a largely English-speaking organization. So I brought the multilingualism angle as something that I had experienced in my own community and felt like was a pressing issue. I saw my own community not doing right by multilingual people. And I felt like my classroom was a place where we could do better, where students could leave with a different perspective than they came in with. However, I was very unclear on what all that might look like and mostly stuck to a grammatical syllabus that was handed to me with occasional sidebars like, oh, multilingual people and local community and you should volunteer, because I didn't actually have a path to follow to make my curriculum reflect my ideals. When I conducted classroom research, that is when I started to gather, I was able through my research to make a direct correlation between what particular teachers were doing and the transformative outcomes their students were experiencing. And I could see that some teachers had outrageously transformative outcomes for many of their students, and other teachers' students were pretty much reporting the same perspectives that they came in with. And so my research showed me that many students were having this conflict about multilingualism in their community, their feelings about immigration. So that's where all of this comes from for me. It's also a great example with a mixed group because so much of what I do is rooted in Spanish, and multilingualism is something we can all talk about. However, if you are going to include social justice related topics in your teaching, there's two pieces of advice that I think will simplify your life. One is go small and individual. Once again, generalizations are the enemy of transformative learning. So if you're trying to talk about social justice, don't talk about big problems and all the people they affect and all the places that it's happening. Talk about a specific location, a specific person, a specific household. Tell people stories, help us connect to actual humans. And it's okay, we'll miss the big picture, but that's fine because we don't have to get 100% of the knowledge at first. We have to make that connection to the topic, to the people who are experiencing this, so that we can go on and make good choices about how to invest our cognitive resources later on down the line, maybe when we're long gone from this language classroom. And then the second thing I would say is, instead of asking your students what topics they want to address in class, ask them what issues they feel the most strongly about in their own homes, in their own communities, on campus. Find out where their passions are for the problems they're experiencing here. And then you, with your incredible content and geographical knowledge, you can figure out how the things they're already passionate about here are happening in similar or different ways in other places, and you can show them different perspectives. They already know their own perspective, they're already invested in it. Get them to translate that emotional energy and that passion to the experiences that other people are having. So instead of relying on them to know what issues might be relevant to the class, they can report on what's relevant to them, and then you can figure out how that's relevant to the class.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
My
Very
pleasure.
helpful.
Thank you so much for chatting.
Okay, one more question from Zoom, then we'll open up to the audience. And if anybody has to leave, by all means, we understand. And to reiterate what Stacey said earlier, there is food and drink in the back, so don't be shy.
Don't be shy.
Anna, are you still on Zoom, and are you able to unmute yourself and ask your questions?
Yes. So I think maybe you already answered some parts of this earlier, but I was just wondering what inspired you to learn languages in the first place, specifically Spanish. What inspired you to teach Spanish, and then what inspired your research?
And Anna, actually, will you do us a favor and introduce yourself to everybody, because not everybody knows you.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a high school junior and I love learning languages.
Amazing. Thank you for asking that question. I didn't expect to answer a personal question. So I grew up in California until I was 12 years old. I was born and raised in the Bay Area, and my neighborhood happened to be primarily a Spanish-speaking neighborhood. And I did not speak Spanish because my family is of Swedish descent. And so I was just fascinated and did everything phonologically to try to get the sounds, but never actually learned any meaning in the language until I got to high school. And then they start letting you choose what you're going to study. And so I studied Latin and Spanish and French and every language that they would let me take. And then the big change happened when I actually started meeting and loving individual people who spoke different languages than me. And sometimes communication was very challenging, or cultural nuances made it hard for us to find common ground. And I discovered that being completely head over heels in love with lots of people from lots of different places is absolutely the way to go. No matter what you do professionally, or what kind of a home you make for yourself, having a big group of international friends is actually the best life possible. So that's how I got here.
That's so cool. Thank you.
I hope that you get to have that experience too.
Oh yeah, Anna has a very bright future ahead of her. I know
Nice.
that. So let's just intervene here for a minute, and please help me thank Stacey for this wonderful and inspiring presentation. I think lots of new ideas for our own classrooms. So thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. We got through 2 out of 3 parts of the talk, so it went great.
Perfect, perfect. There we go.